So I would love for you to explain spiral dynamics.
I was just talking to someone about spiral dynamics. I was teaching a class on it, and then I handed it over to her to begin teaching. And she's taught it a couple times now. And she was just reporting to me what an amazing experience it was that now that she was really feeling fluid with the material, it took her a couple times of teaching it to really digest it and make it into her own class, you know. Um, but how energized very, very different people were all by this content. And uh, and just as an example, in the class, for instance, was a kind of a rural mountain man with a big old rugged beard, and he's got some kind of liberal values, but he's very down to earth and pro gun and all this kind of stuff. Then there's another person in there who was very radical feminist and progressive political thinker and very urban, but with some interest in shamanism and things like that. Um, and another person who's very much into the trans rights and all that stuff. So there are very different people in the class, and all of them were moving in their own world spaces and navigating values differences. All of them are encountering that in their different workplaces and world spaces and
Mm.
family lives and all of that. And so they found through this spiral dynamics class a way to understand some of the different um, values that inform people's worldviews and decision making and commitments and things like that, that just clarifies the field a lot, because you see all these tensions between different groups and everybody's talking each other down and silencing each other and usually polarizing around one or two perspectives and denying or downplaying the others. And so spiral dynamics is one way of looking at a spectrum of value systems that seem to unfold in a particular order. They're not all available to everyone at once, because usually the ideas and the commitments of one value system grow out of the problems of the previous value system.
Mm.
So there is a value system that you're inhabiting, and it fulfills you. It serves different purposes for you, um, and it helps you orient. But there are also always limitations to our worldviews and to our value systems, and eventually you come up against contradictions and things that your own approach can't really handle that well, and that usually puts you into a crisis mode, and then you find a way out of it. So spiral dynamics maps a series of values perspectives. It's bigger than just values. It's kind of worldview frames in a way, and each one grows out of the next, and it's usually out of the shortcomings, the limitations of the next, or in order to deal with new complexities that weren't present when the original value system emerged.
Mm.
So just I won't go over the whole thing, but very easily we can recognize uh, for instance, the spectrum between red, which would be kind of tribal or, honor-based, um, strength-based, but kind of individualistic and egotistical, claiming your own power kind of perspective. Then out of that field of warriors, right, eventually you need to be able to organize them to serve a larger purpose. That's the value of blue, of traditionalism. You gather the warriors from the different tribes and you unite them around a single vision, a single understanding that they can have kinship beyond the blood connections or whatever. You can begin to build a civilization on rule of law, on shared commitment to spiritual principles. So that's the whole emergence of all of the different traditional religious kingdoms, all of those grew out of taming the excesses of the wild warrior tribes and gathering them together into a common purpose. into a shared traditional community, right? And there's a whole focus on belonging and law and making a commitment to not only to your brother or sister of the tribe, or even just but to principles, right? That you're committing to love of neighbor, or you're committing to, the one God above all, that unifies, right? But then eventually that can run into, different limitations, um, especially if you find that if it's organized around kind of mythic belief and conformity to tradition and standards. The more rational thinking develops, the more that you move out of concrete operational thinking and into formal operational thinking, and you begin to do more independent logical analysis. Some of those things don't hold up anymore, right?
Mm.
You can't justify them. And so that's where the orange value system emerges, where it's turning much more around kind of authentic insight through rational process that's not just based on reception of traditional knowledge. Blue is the reception of traditional knowledge, and the interest is in the conformity of the group.
Mm-hmm.
With orange, there's much more sticking true to lines of intellectual inquiry and scientific research, and the whole scientific industrial culture emerges out of that and consolidates around various different versions of orange around the world. It doesn't show up exactly the same way in different countries, but it's generally turning around the same basic principles of individualism, of rights, of rational thought, things like that. Then in that context where there's a big blooming of abundance and growth and all kinds of things that can happen through, that liberation of thinking in orange, it can create situations that again begin to become too much for orange to handle. And still orange is looking for the truth, and it's looking for it's following rationality as far as it can go in science, but eventually, you come up into, I think, enough complexity of the environment and enough differences in perspectives that you begin to see even the orange worldview relativized against others, and that you begin to see unconscious drives that were informing it. And you open up to needing to navigate and finding ways to navigate a greater plurality of perspectives that do not marginalize certain perspectives in the way that the orange value may do if it's only relying on rationality and it can't see any value in religious truths, right? But gradually you begin to open up to, okay, there maybe is value here. And actually, in following only this path, we lost some of the gifts that the other way had. So anyway, that there's an opening up into a greater sensitivity to perspective and a greater you could say a greater sensitivity to the unconscious dynamics of power that tend to underprivilege or even marginalize groups of people. So green rallies around how can we recognize those who've been driven to the shadow or driven under the system, who are neglected by the system. And so green is like an explosion of pluralistic values. But then out of that, there's usually some kind of stagnation, because simple pluralism begins to just like swirl around, but nothing can happen, right? It's hard for people to come together. It's hard for people to generate any cultural forward progress when there's no recognized ground to stand on anymore. And so then that's where the integral model starts to come in, is to honor the plurality and to honor the truth, so that you can begin to build structures that can marshal plurality around shared projects and around shared visions and perspectives, without reducing things to a single dominant view, the way previous value systems have done. So that's just an example. It's not the full thing of it. It's pretty complex and a lot to digest, but
Yeah.
uh, the idea there, though, is that often politically, looking at what's going on in the news and culturally, um, it's a big clash between especially blue, orange, and green.
Yeah.
There's the traditionalists who want the Bible and the way things were and to hold on to tradition and all of that. There's the rationalists and the science oriented who want things to be much more focused on what's this worldly and real and provable and demonstrable and aligned again with the insights of science and medicine. It does away with the bullshit. And then there's the green that wants to be sensitive to all the marginalized different groups. It's usually progressive thinking. It usually is trying to highlight racial injustices or expand perspectives around gender and things like that. And the big culture wars that we're experiencing are largely these three groups colliding with each other.
I would say
Yeah.
that from my perspective, that first of all, that was that was excellent. I'm so glad I asked you to explain spiral dynamics because mine would have been a lot more two-dimensional than yours. But I and Elliot talks about this a lot. That it oftentimes we have this idea that we need to climb up the levels, but oftentimes if you're really green, for instance, it doesn't mean that you've really embraced the blue or the orange. Like
Right.
sometimes you might have skipped one or skipped a couple, and you need to to be a complete person, trademarked, you need to come down and explore every single level really, really well. And so for instance, orange can science-based makes a lot of sense, but I've heard orange also described as like capitalism. And so, you go from the traditional regular businesses that kind of fit within a certain model to like, oh, I could tweak this and exploit this part of the system and then
Yeah.
kind of make it into my own and like make myself money. And then with money I have power. Maybe that's one of the good or bad power, whatever you choose to do with it. I mean, power is
Right.
kind of neutral in many ways, but with a lot of greens, it seems like they have all these wonderful ideas about treating humanity properly and raising everyone up in an equal way, but they don't understand how money works. And
Mhm.
the fact that you have like the government can't give us endless money. And maybe sometimes the best things to do is to start your own business that helps humanity. And for every piece of software you sell, you plant 5 trees or something. Like
Right.
there's and also power, the red personal power. To me, it seems like personal power is very much it's very physical. And there's this typical idea of the Google software programmer who essentially controls a large part of humanity's culture by
Mm.
by designing systems that we use every day, but he is emaciated and doesn't treat his body well, and there is um there's a part of his humanity that is missing if he doesn't work on his own personal power. Because from my opinion, a lot of these software programmers at the top don't want the power, so they kind of outsource it to an AI or kind of pretend that they aren't in charge of humanity's future.
Mm.
And so it's like by not taking on the power, you don't not take on the power, you just pretend you don't take on the power, and then you don't use it properly because you kind of don't want the responsibility. And this is just, I mean, I'm criticizing a straw man here, but so I think it is important for me anyway, from my own personal story, like I I kind of skipped the blue level, and I'm still not a completely structured person, but like I realized a few years ago that it was kind of a big realization for me, and it was kind of triggered by like I was really into Jordan Peterson. Now, I think I've grown past him, but no, not past him. I've integrated parts of him, and then now
Mhm.
but I realized that tradition was really, really important, and it was there for a reason. And like sometimes we need to grow past traditions, and I think women's education is great, and we should keep that. But like some traditions are there for a very, very good reason, and we shouldn't just act like they're stupid and old and archaic and get rid of them because um sometimes they keep a culture and a humanity together.
Yeah.
There's one more thing that I wanted to address, which is and I understand why you did it, but to me purple is so interesting.
Mm.
um the purple level is the one at the bottom, and I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit on that.
Yeah, very bottom is beige.
Beige, sorry.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, no, but it's almost there's not very much you can say about beige. That's strictly body-based survival,
Mhm.
right? Um, we don't encounter that very much though, unless it's like the infant, um, where the main thing is just feed me, and there's not a lot of interaction going on. Or, um, but for purple, um, you know, one of the one of the exercises that I used to do in that class, and I've shared it on some forums before, uh, as an exercise for myself, just to play with it, with spiral dynamics when I was first learning of it. I used to ask myself to think about days, ways, and forays. And the days would be to remember when you inhabited that value space. The ways is how does that still show up now? And the forays would be any times that you can recall where you did a deliberate effort to step into a different value space to try to experiment there. What's that like? If you've been in Orange all the time, but you want to go sit in a church, and see what's there, or you've been in the church all the time, but you want to break out and go to a, you know, humanist club or something like that, right? Um, those are the forays where you're wanting to step into a different um, sphere and experience that. So thinking about that, the purple, I mean, I don't know that we even have that many groups that are strictly at purple anymore. Um, Most of them, even if like a lot among many of the tribes, they span many levels. They're not just purple, but purple is very much focused um, on shared identity with the tribe and the group. It's kind of prior to a strong, clear ego emerging. The self is much more participatory and part informed by the overall tribe and group. There's a lot of you could say magical thinking in terms of relating to the world in and as the forms of different kinds of intelligences and powers, and the whole of your life and practice is to um, find different resonances with those powers and be in harmony and relationship with those things. Um, and yeah, it's a different level and different experience of causality. Um, but yeah, it's a tribal, communal, very communally oriented, um, and there's a lot that's very nurturant about it. But there's also some of the nurturance that can feel stifling, and that's where the red begins to push out, and to begin to experience its own um, initial independence from
Mm,
that collectivity of purple.
mm.
But I
Yeah.
was thinking about like the days, ways, and forays. The reason I brought that up is I was thinking about like reflecting on uh, there's a belief that, at purple, that usually objects are imbued with a power, and you can take on that power by taking that thing on yourself, right? And I remember when I was very young, I loved Ultraman. I don't know if you remember Ultraman from the Japanese TV show.
No, I don't.
Japanese superhero, silver and red robot, and he could go like this and shoot lasers from his hands. And, when I was a little kid, I really loved Ultraman. And I wanted to be like him. So I broke open an Etch-a-Sketch and I took out all the mercury and I covered myself with the mercury, which is probably what happened to me and why I'm like this now. Um, all this brain damage. But I covered myself in that silver mercury, and I felt that I was going to take on that power, because that's that purple kind of thinking. I can participate in the power, so that by having the silver, I am that being.